And I'm going to let everyone in. Okay. Hello and welcome to our program tonight. I am Esther Kutash and I'm the Executive Director of the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. Our foundation operates and programs the Horvitz Wasserman Holocaust Memorial Plaza in Center City, Philadelphia. Thank you for everybody to join us today for this program where we explore the intersection of technology and testimony with Greg Irwin from the USC Shoah Foundation. Greg is the head of content management at the USC Shoah Foundation. This event is part of a week-long series called Learning Through Testimony, which is our 7th Holocaust Education Week we have done in collaboration with the Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee and the Wasserman Center for Human Rights in Boise. This week-long series completes tomorrow with an event led by the Wasserman Center discussing the transfer of trauma with author Elizabeth Rosner. We'll drop information about this event in the chat in just a second. And now back to today's programming. We're so excited to welcome Greg Irwin. Greg leads content management at the USC Shoah Foundation, and he will discuss the foundation's history, methodology, and archival practices in collecting testimony. Greg will also show us the various technological advancements that the foundation spearheaded in preserving memory and testimony. Our foundation has a special relationship with the USC Shoah folks. Greg and his team have developed an app for our site called iWalk that guides you through our Holocaust Memorial Plaza, connecting artifacts and installations with Holocaust survivor testimony. Greg will be presenting for about 40 minutes, and we'll take then questions from the audience. Please direct all questions to me. We have the chat box, and I will then ask them from Greg. And now, warm welcome to you, Greg. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Esther. I'm going to pull up my little slideshow here. One moment. I think we'll be sharing my screen now. Wonderful. Well, yes. Hello, everyone. As Esther noted, I am Greg Irwin, and I serve as head of content management within the education department at USC Shoah Foundation, the Institute for Visual History and Education. And first, I want to thank the Peltz Holocaust Education Resource Center, the Wasserman Center for Human Rights, and our lovely friends, the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation, for having me among a really magnificent speaker series that you slated for Holocaust Education Week. I've been part of USC Shoah Foundation since 2014. And while the majority of this work that I've been doing has been focused on our educational output, that work is at the confluence of where testimony and technology meet. And as you'll see, when we innovate at the Institute, it's to further the impact of the stories in our archive. We work to help new voices that have not necessarily been unearthed find new audiences. And we want to maximize the change that those voices can inspire. As a quick little overview of the talk I'll be doing for y'all, starting with just an overview of USC Shoah Foundation, our history, and that of the Visual History Archive, otherwise known as the VHA. I'm also going to be touching on some questions of how to access the content and the ethical nature and some of the core questions that we have to ask ourselves and how we handle stewarding this content. And then finally, we're going to talk about how we innovate to extend our impact. A key piece of history that we often share is that our founder was Steven Spielberg. When he made the film Schindler's List in 1994, he traveled to Poland with a number of Holocaust survivors. Here he names at least a dozen. And quote, Mr. Spielberg, he said, "At least a dozen Holocaust survivors journeyed there, and often through tears, they began telling us their stories. I kept saying to them, thank you for telling me, but I wish you could say this to a camera because this is important testimony. I asked them if they'd be willing to do this, and they all said yes. And thus was born the phenomenon that became USC Shoah Foundation. where we collected what is now over 55,000 testimonies, not just from survivors and witnesses of the Holocaust, but from other genocides and incidents of mass violence as well. Our mission in 1994, when the Shoah Foundation began, was to ensure that generations never forget, quote, what so few live to tell, and simultaneously to teach teachers to teach tolerance. So there was a core sort of professional development, educational spirit in that, a belief that testimony has the power to impact the way students treat each other and approach their world. After we had collected our first 50,000 testimonies in the 90s, our mission changed, more focused primarily on that second piece, to overcome prejudice, intolerance, and bigotry and the suffering they cause through the educational use of the Foundation's visual history testimonies. I'll note this is not our current mission statement today, but you can see how education remains front and center. The belief that testimonies are tools for teaching, for changing the ways we approach each other, and this elevating that power to actually being a key tool in the mission to overcome hate around the world. Let's talk a little bit about what testimony is. Essentially, these are recorded stories from survivors or witnesses of genocide or mass violence. Our average testimony length runs about 2 hours. When USC Shoah Foundation approaches recording a testimony, we focus on capturing the story of the person's entire life. So that means from their first memories up until essentially the day of the interview. We do this because we want to, for several reasons. First, we want to capture the full breadth of how these individuals' lives were transformed by the histories they lived through. Their lives after the war were highly consistently reshaped by their experiences during war or mass violence and genocide. We also find that the pre-war experiences can be really powerful tools in preserving the histories of the communities that the violence and genocide destroyed, such as, for example, many of the Jewish spaces that had existed in pre-war Europe. So these testimonies capture entire lives, as well as individualized experiences of the stages of genocide. So as the genocides progress, as we move closer and closer, as the apparatuses that lead to mass violence are set into place, we hear how these individuals experience those firsthand and then discover the aftermath. We capture the full breadth of each victim and each story along the way. I love this photo. It shows 5 different survivors, all of whom have been interviewed by USC Shoah Foundation, from 5 different incidents of mass violence. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. In the topmost, we see Dario Gabay, who had been part of the Sonderkommando in Auschwitz. He was responsible for the grim and terrifying work of cleaning the crematoria. We see Sarapol Lim, who was a Cambodian genocide survivor and a longtime active supporter of the Cambodian diaspora community in Long Beach. We see Araceli Garrido, who was a Guatemalan genocide survivor. Yevnig Salibian, who was an Armenian genocide survivor, was a child when it happened. And we see Edith Umugiraneza, who is a survivor of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. I'll note that all of these individuals have given testimony that we feature in our archive. 2 of them, Dario on top and Yevnig in the middle, have passed since the photo was taken. But all of them share their stories with us, and many of them dedicated their entire lives, not just to telling their stories, but to seeing other stories from genocide survival shared, because they believe that there is power in that sharing. These are faces of survivors, but also faces of activists and of educators. I also want to highlight just one key case study of how testimony can also factor into responding to current conflict. This is a survivor of the anti-Rohingya mass violence in Burma. And gathering testimony from Rohingya at a refugee camp in Bangladesh quickly became a priority for us because we were able to mobilize. We had the right connections to the right people to help bring us in as researchers and documentarians, not as journalists, but as a team ready to help get the story seen and allow the people themselves who suffered from the violence to have a voice and to have agency in a community where not many individuals could speak the Rohingya language, so they were not getting a seat at the table. We were able to record their voices, record their stories, and translate them, allowing their testimonies to be seen on CNN, and seen by policymakers, and seen at the United Nations. There's real activist power here too. So today, USC Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive features testimonies from survivors of the Holocaust, the Cambodian genocide, the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, the Armenian genocide, the Guatemalan genocide, the Nanjing massacre, anti-Rohingya mass violence, the South Sudan Civil War, Central African Republic conflict, and individuals who were impacted by contemporary anti-Semitism. But within those, as we call them, sort of collections, we also see a wide range of experiences. So in our Holocaust collection, which is by far our largest, over 52,000, we see survivors, but also over 1,000 rescuers, individuals who often risk their lives to save lives of others. We see liberators who fought in the war and helped liberate concentration camps. We see Sinti Roma survivors, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witness survivors, individuals who participated in war crimes trials. We see LGBT survivors. We see in the Armenian collection, rescuers and foreign witnesses alongside survivors. And in our Genocide Against Tutsi collection, we see Tutsi survivors and rescuers and also elders of the community. And then there's interesting categories too, like miscellaneous. You see World War II or Armenian genocide. These often exist because there were powerful narratives that we couldn't necessarily find an exclusive experience group to categorize. So one of our recent miscellaneous World War II testimonies was from someone who was part of the Hitler Youth, and she chose to tell her story. We also have as a case study and how hate can be corrupting and appealing, and especially for young children. Or in our Armenian genocide collection, we have a miscellaneous interview from Henry Morgenthau III, who was the grandson of US Ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau Sr., who had been a powerful advocate for the Armenian people on behalf of the United States during the time of the genocide. Today, our collection spans over 6 testimonies collected from 65 countries, over 55,000 testimonies in 43 languages, 115,000 plus hours of video, averaging 2 hours in length. So if you do the math, and I already have, 115,000 hours is over 13 years if you watched every single testimony front to back. Our collection to help find that content also involves 66,000 keywords, which help lead us to 725,000 images approximately, and nearly 2 million names. And our full collection, although there are a variety of ways you can access smaller pieces of it that I'll get into a little later, these are available at 170 sites around the world in 15 countries. Let's talk a little bit first about how you actually find testimony. When you have 13 years of video, how do you track any individual moment down, whether you're a researcher or an educator or an interested member of the community? That's where our indexers, like these two folks, come into play. And I assure you, we don't still use these this era of Macintosh computer. That is a dated photo. Taking a look at how a single testimony manifests, we see testimonies. And you have the video player, but you also have it broken down into segments. Historically, we would ask our indexers to try to sort of estimate when a segment began and ended based on, they would decide when a story began and ended. But they realized that the nature of testimony is a little too variable for that. People go on tangents, people restructure their framing. It's hard to necessarily expect everyone to structure their testimony as a series of cogent, coherent stories across their life. So instead, we now organize every testimony, slice it up into each minute. And so we search by the minute down to indexing terms. So here, we know that in segment 54, which you see here is the 54th minute, because each tape's about 30 minutes long. And so we're at 24 minutes into presumably his second tape. Here, he's going to talk about experiencing the November pogrom, Kristallnacht, in Berlin. And witnessing a synagogue attack, or at least seeing the aftermath of it. We can tell this and use a powerful and/or search functions within our research tools that allow us to get to what we're looking for. And this moment of his testimony actually is a very powerful clip that we use with our students everywhere, where he talks about having seen broken glass, and he and a close friend were out bicycling, and they stopped and helped someone clean up the glass, and everyone else around them was just watching. And he says that no one else spoke up, and that when it came down to it, it was the silence that did the harm. And there's a lot you can unpack there. Indexing terms are broad. You can see here alone, there's a tiny snippet of the breadth that we find in the overarching zone of feelings and thoughts, where you see trauma-related dreams. You see a little glimpse at the range of motivations. You see that we can find testimony stories about intergenerational genocide impact, how parents or descendants were affected by the trauma of genocide. We also see humor. How did humor help sustain people? Or are they making jokes that may be inappropriate? Who knows? About their experience. Where there's so much to unpack. There's emotions, first impressions, and then far, far more. But testimony is not just two-dimensional video, or at least people telling stories. Here, Kurt, who I introduced you to a moment ago, he is also a cantor. And so there's also, I have video here. He shares musical recitals of pieces that he actually performed in order to sustain himself in the camps. The Nazis forced him to perform for them because he has a beautiful voice. And so here he shares with us the music that he survived from. Also, most of our testimonies feature photographs. Survivors, that 175,000 photographs I referenced before, these are historical documents that survivors provided us with and narrate through to help enrich their story. But testimony doesn't even have to involve video. The wonderful Richard Hovannisian, who I know presented earlier this week, collected a magnificent series of audio-only testimonies from survivors of the Armenian genocide, which we've been in the process of adding into our collection, and this is one of those. However, we also want to not just collect testimonies, we want to make sure that they survive and that they're preserved forever. So we underwent a massive undertaking because in the 1990s, we filmed all of our testimonies on film, which is not permanent in the way that a lot of digital content can be. So we underwent a multi-year, multi-million-dollar process to convert our testimonies from videotape to high-quality digital recordings, which also involve post-production work, improving the audiovisual, any aberrations that may have occurred, and then storing those testimonies in multiple formats, diverse locations, and in the cloud to ensure that when we told the survivors who gave us their stories, we promised them that those stories would be shared in perpetuity, and we needed to make sure that we would keep that promise. Another interesting question that often emerges around accuracy, because these are memories. Memory is part of the work, and it is imperfect. It's part of the scholarship. We have testimonies sometimes from the same individual that were recorded from different decades, different times, because so you'll have the same survivor interviewed at different stages in their lifetime, because we also, as I'll touch on a little later, we're also bringing in testimonies like that piece I referenced from Richard Hovannisian, testimonies collected by partners at different eras who want to sort of create a breadth to our archive and allow them to be compared and navigated with using the same index and using the same tools and the same educational and research angles. So while we have, so sometimes you'll see the same see multiple testimonies from the same individual, and they may not have tell the same story the same way 100% of the time in the 80s versus the 90s versus the 2000s. And as far as we are concerned, that is okay. That is reality, that is memory. When sharing testimony with students, we're rigorous. We want to make sure to the best of our ability that our interviewees' stories are not misrepresenting history, but this is also the nature of primary source work. Testimony collection began actually with the Boder Archive in 1946, when Boder went to displaced persons camps and interviewed survivors there. But most of our testimonies, The 50,000 that we recorded in the 90s were recorded in the 90s, and some in the 2000s, which leaves a good 50 plus years of distance from the trauma. And they're remarkably detailed, but a lot of time has passed and it can't always be accurate, but those experiences are human and the soul of them is genuine. And testimony still proves a timeless reflection of how each interviewee perceived their experience. And that perception to us is sacred. How do you access it? We have our visual history archive. The full 55,000 plus collection is available at vha.usc.edu. However, it is only available from those 170 access sites I referenced before. If you're trying to reach them from home, you can go to vhaonline.usc.edu, where we offer a more limited collection of 4,000 testimonies. But that's a lot of testimonies, a lot that you can explore across our different collections there. And you can also view the full index of our testimony archive. You can't necessarily see the other 51,000 videos. Finally, we also offer Eyewitness, which is a site near and dear to my heart as I serve as webmaster for it, which is our educational website, which also offers a full 3,500 testimonies for educational use. I'll note all of these are available at no cost to anyone as users. Certainly as cost to us as we make it, but that's a different story. So once you have these testimonies and the work as we continue, our mission today has become something more positive than trying to counter hate. We actually believe that testimony can foster something good. And that is specifically that we develop empathy, understanding, and respect through testimony. We do this through two platforms. One is research. Our Center for Advanced Genocide Research uses the archive to dig out interdisciplinary revelations about genocide and also about genocide prevention, looking at how these processes happen, comparing them, looking at the human element. But not only do they look at genocide, they also look at the human condition. They can explore the nature of storytelling or of memory, as I was talking about before, or of the limitations and possibilities of film, and a whole lot more. So since the center opened in 2014, VHA testimony has been used across 53 academic disciplines of the center. The other space is education. And we'll dive into this quite a bit, but the key point is that testimonies can support classrooms around the world. We use using all those different languages represented in our archive while teaching about key essential histories and connecting students to one another and to their world, inspiring them to take action to make the world a better place. So why are we at USC? We became USC Shoah Foundation, the Institute for Visual History and Education at USC in 2006, because we had a massive collection of testimony and we knew we wanted to do those two things, research and educate. And there was simply nowhere better to be than a globally minded, innovation-driven university. And it's been a beautiful relationship. Today, we actually have three different types of testimonies, and between the years of 2020 and 2025, we're in the process of, we've set the goal of adding another 5,000. I'm going to start in the sort of the top right of this slide where we see a trio of two-dimensional interviews, testimonies, as I've been describing them previously, just as kind of reflection of how we're going about this. In the top right, featuring Jesus Tiku Osorio, who is a survivor of the Guatemalan genocide, simply trying to emphasize that we still prioritize gathering a diversity of experiences. And we want to reach across genocides, across mass violence, and across the broader collection of atrocities that have been seen around the world. We also, however, recognize that Holocaust survivors are getting older and that their stories are going to be lost if we are not able to chronicle them. To that end, we've been working to, as I was alluding before, draw in testimonies that are filmed by our colleagues at different organizations. So here we see Claire Baum was filmed by the Azrieli Foundation in Toronto in this last decade. And then we're also just trying to gather more diverse experiences from that Holocaust story to sort of help paint a fuller picture. So here we see at the bottom left of that top trio, Ursula Matthews, who was that Hitler Youth member who I referenced before. But two-dimensional testimony is not the only way we film. In the bottom right, we see a glimpse of our testimony on location program, which I'm going to allude to a little more later, but traveling with survivors to the sites where history happened to them. So here we see Max Eisen outside the Arbeitsmachtfrei gate at Auschwitz, telling his story to a 360-degree camera where students, researchers alike can stand essentially there with him, whether in virtual reality or on a device, and look around at the space and see him talk about how that space shaped his perception of what his experience in Auschwitz would be. But it's not just going to camps with this program. We'll also go to the sites where these people grew up, help maybe for the first time since they were kids, to tell that story. We also, I'm not going to say the bottom left, just to the left, we've been pioneering our Dimensions in Testimony program, which we'll get to see a little later, but this is essentially, we call them interactive biographies, where survivors, in this case, we see Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who is a cellist who was able to survive the Holocaust through her tremendous musical talent. But basically, they're interviewed with hundreds, if not over 1,000 questions that have been asked and drawn from students, researchers, and others alike, to put the ultimate product becoming essentially a filmed interview where you can ask the question and natural language processing will perceive your question and provide you with with an appropriate answer from the survivor. So this is the closest thing to a conversation that can be possible without the survivor physically being there. And now 2 at least survivors who've been filmed in this program have already passed, but their stories and their personalities can still be connected to through Dimensions in Testimony. So all is to say, we do a lot of innovating at USC Shoah Foundation, but we're not led by new technology. As I alluded before, we're led by testimony. How can we use the technologies available to us in this world to best serve collecting and distributing survivor testimony? We at the Shoah Foundation are the gatekeepers, and it is our responsibility to steward the gifts that the survivors have given us, the stories, their life stories, their photographs, and more, with the expectation that we would treat these materials with responsibility forever. So any innovation must be rooted in furthering the impact that those stories can make and in helping uncover new stories that we can tell. So let's start by considering how we teach with testimony. I'll read you a couple quotes. Through testimony, it's argued, survivors and receivers, so the viewer, engage with some of the most critical political, existential, and moral questions that a society can ask concerning identity, otherness, existence, values, and enemies. These questions are at the core of how society and its people redefine themselves and at the codes by which they live by. Putting that into practice, I love the story from my colleague, Dr. Claudia Wiedemann, who is formerly Director of Education at USC Shoah Foundation. Now she has a new role. But when she was applying for her first job within the education department, she was tasked as part of her interview with creating a lesson for students using testimony. And Claudia grew up undocumented in 1970s LA. And she was watching the story of survivor Helena Horowitz, who talked about disguising herself, pretending to be Christian, making up lies on the spot, having near misses, having to cover her own truth, and having to sometimes coming to believe her own lie. And Claudia felt a connection. She wrote, Helena Horowitz described in very clear and rich detail the ways I also sustained my own false identity, growing up as an undocumented student in 1970s LA. Helena Horowitz was telling my story too. And this is core to how we approach education. We believe that testimony is not just a tool for teaching about the histories of the past, it's a way to approach the problems of the present. So we do this through a variety of platforms, but one big one is Eyewitness, which is our primary pathway for teaching with testimony. I alluded to it before at eyewitness.usc.edu. We have a wide variety of activities in Eyewitness, over 400 at this point, but I'm just going to note that Claudia's activity there actually became published. Here we see, you would watch a clip of Helena's testimony and you're asked, what strategies did Helena use in her day-to-day life to hide her secret? What did you think she felt during these moments of hiding? And then making it personal. Think back on moments when you have had to hide a part of your identity. What strategies did you use to hide, and how did this make you feel? So then you'll see up ahead, students are actually going to listen to stories from a young woman who's an undocumented student in LA who was filmed in 2016, talking about her experience. And then they're sort of asked to compare and to explore and reflect. Eyewitness contains, yes, 400 activities. We also have over 1,500 pedagogically potent clips of testimony that are sorted by topic. We offer a video editor, allowing students to create video essays in response to the topics of their lessons. We have a timeline builder, allowing them to trace stories through space and time. We have a full collection of testimonies. So you can see, you could search for the musical recitals in that space too, reaching 3,500 testimonies. Students develop research skills. We also have activities in 11 languages, making sure that we can extend our global reach. We have a program, a curriculum for Jewish education. We have a partnership curriculum based on a podcast, We Share the Same Sky, that we help produce. We also work to support testimony-based lesson teaching to support various teaching with film. So you got to teach films with testimony, including, say, The Promise, which is a recent film that sort of the first major motion picture telling stories from the Armenian genocide. I'm also going to note Eyewitness is changing. We're going to be launching a fully redesigned version of the site and back to school this year, which I'm very excited about, and it's been a long time coming. Students can also get inspired to take action based on testimony. So one way we innovated was looking at the Stronger Than Hate Challenge, formerly known as the Eyewitness Video Challenge, where we partnered with Discovery Education to extend its reach. And so students have been inspired by testimony to take action in their communities, to help support immigrants, to find programs in their schools, to build programs in their schools that help embrace the diversity of themselves and their peers and allow people to express their identities. We've had students who really resonated with the fact that certain survivors write and shared poetry as a way to cope with their trauma. And so they recognized that's something they could access too, created poetry clubs to develop emotional support for each other. Students seeing those small acts of kindness and the ways that those acts, a little bit of food or a nice word, could actually help sustain a person's life and stick with them in their memories 50 years later in testimony. And so they've come up with really innovative and lovely ways to promote kindness in the classroom. Most recently, we saw a student do a really fabulous piece of digital art supporting the movement for Black Lives. I'm going to touch a little bit on virtual reality, which I alluded to before. And this, I think, raises some interesting ethical questions too in how we approach education. So one of our virtual reality projects was called The Last Goodbye, where this gentleman, Pinchas Guter, who you'll also see later on, as he was the first interviewee in the Dimensions in Testimony interactive biography system. Pinchas lost his family at Majdanek death camp. And he returned to the camp with a film crew to film a 360 film where he takes the viewer on a tour of Majdanek, a place where I personally may never go, and where most viewers may never go, but you get to go here. You can walk around and you hear his stories. You see how each of these individual spaces impacted him, and it's a deeply powerful experience. But VR also has other benefits as well. It's novel, it's different, it's encompassing. So we made this film, Lala, actually trying to reach primary level students with testimony. Using power of animation, using the story of a young boy and his dog, a true story told by survivor Roman Kent, who's spoken on stages across the world. He's played tennis with Yitzhak Rabin. He's got photos of himself with Bill and Hillary Clinton. And the story he always wants to tell, he lost his parents in Auschwitz. He always talks about the dog they had, Lala, who taught him that love is stronger than hate, because he was separated from Lala when his family was sent to the ghetto. But Lala miraculously found them, sniffed her way through the fences, through the ghetto, and came scratching at the door. And so that was a story that we felt that young students could resonate with. It was a story that helped, they could see that there's prejudice they could see the dangers of hate, how a young boy could be separated from their dog, and this dog that's so purely loving, but they don't have to, and they recognize that this was rooted in anti-Semitism, but they don't have to engage with crematoria or gas chambers to feel something from that. And I'm just going to show you a brief little snippet of that if I can pull off a shift in my screen share, because I think it also illustrates a couple points.
So, we called her Lala, which means doll.
See Roman in his room, and then he's going to continue talking. But we're now in this 360 space. I'm also just going to note,
we have no idea what kind of a dog she was.
That as we follow along, all the while, there's this stool,
and we loved her.
And in the live action section, that stool is also there. And I highlight this because it illustrates the fact that you are constantly, you never leave that room where you're sitting with Roman. And there's an important reason for that. Because in Holocaust education, as we explore it, we believe simulation must be avoided. What does that mean? Essentially, we don't believe it is acceptable or positive pedagogy to allow a student or encourage a student, or frankly anybody, to believe that they are experiencing some simulation of what it was like to be in the Holocaust. First off, it's traumatic to have, say, witnessed yourself inside of a camp, as it were, then wearing a headset. But it's also a poor representation. If you have a headset on and you feel like, oh, I see what it was like now, you really don't. You don't see, you may see something, but you don't feel anything it was like, because you can take your headset off and you're safe. It's a improper pedagogical approach. And so to that end, we prioritize that with virtual reality. So we want to make sure that a student knows that they are always in the present on that stool with Roman. They've never gone back to the 1930s. And the sort of abstract storybook animation style is intended to help illustrate that. Similarly with The Last Goodbye, following Pinchas into Majdanek, there's probably, there's a, you could see how it could be tempting to try to render Majdanek as it was. There's a technology, it exists, someone can and maybe will do it, but it would be inappropriate, and it's not the point of what we're trying to get at. We're trying to provide people with an experience of navigating that camp as it is today. Now let's talk about iWalk, a project very close to my heart, and I know to our friends at Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. iWalk was originally ideated actually in Hungary. So using the iWalk app now, but it was originally before there was an app, individuals would find themselves in historic sites where the Holocaust happened, and they could navigate, or they can just explore the Jewish ghetto in Budapest. And at individual stops, they would learn about, say, the history of the Dohány Street Synagogue, and they can watch testimony clips that reflect what happened, some significant incidents that happened there, including, like, there's really powerful stories that I don't know if I have quite the time to get into, but where you watch the clip and then you can look up and see that event that changed this woman's life happened on the 4th floor of the building you're standing next to, and that makes it feel more real. But that's not, that approach isn't the exclusive pathway into what an iWalk is capable of. So working with Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation at the Horwitz-Wasserman Holocaust Memorial Plaza, you have this whole series of really powerful, both symbolic and pedagogical resources all around the space that capture the feeling, that help tell the story, that have some emotional impact, and find some really interesting artistic reflections of what the Holocaust was. But our friends at the Remembrance Foundation wanted to find ways of bringing testimony into that experience. So we created a series of iWalks for the Holocaust, for the Memorial Plaza. And so here's one of them, but there's a few where you would go to the different stops, and that, say, the 6 pillars, you would do some additional reading supported by glossary terms, and you could also watch clips of testimony to provide that human presence in the experience. I'm also just, yeah. And I'll just note that this is, while this was designed initially for student use, it's also got a public-facing option as well. So that doesn't involve asking the public questions that would go to their teacher, but they can still do a lot of learning and connect with testimony. Running a little tight on time to make sure we have time for questions. Not going to touch on the testimony on location too much, but it does have some potential intersections with iWalk in that you can be in a space and then see the survivor in that space to really enrich it. And then finally, I wanted to talk to you about dimensions in testimony a little more, which is actually, I'm happy to say, coming to Eyewitness and available online from home with Pinchas Gutera, first of the 18 individuals who have been filmed for Dimensions in Testimony. And it'll be available to the public on April 8th for Yom HaShoah. So students can ask Pinchas questions verbally using the microphone feature or by typing them, and he'll respond. And actually, we can do a little bit of that now. So it looks like, yeah, Esther making a call to send questions to her. But also I will note, and I'm not necessarily going to be able to see the chat as I do this, but I will try to ask Pinchas a couple questions, and if anything comes to your minds, I welcome those as well, and I'm happy to ask, but no pressure. Sometimes it can be a little intimidating to come up with questions for Holocaust survivors off the cuff, but at least to show you the dynamics. Pinchas, how were you liberated?
I would like to share with you a story of the first day of my liberation. And that is as follows. When I ran out and I was there watching all kinds of things, I suddenly spied in a field a wagon with 2 horses spanned in, complete. And I, who had, spent a lot of time with horses on my grandfather's farm in Wielun, loved horses. So I started walking towards this wagon. I looked around and I was looking for the person that owned them or was driving them or for the farmer. I didn't see anybody. So I went closer. Eventually I got onto the wagon and then I suddenly saw the reins of the horses, that they were there and that there was a whip, but nobody. And I waited because I was scared. Somebody belongs to somebody. Suddenly, I decided I pulled the rein, the right rein, this way. And the horse went the way I told it, went right. Left, the rein went left. So I still waited a little while. And then I decided I'm going to drive to Theresienstadt with the horses. So I drove the horses into Theresienstadt. And when I was there, and I realized that nobody is going to claim these horses, I claimed them for myself. And they became my family. They became my closest friends. They just became my life. I couldn't think or do anything except those horses. There were no stalls, so there was a ruined building. I built a stall for them. I went and cut hay. I ransacked the place for oats. It was very difficult to get oats. I took old black bread, which I soaked in water, and I fed it to them because I was worried they weren't getting good food. They got diarrhea from it. So then I had to get a sergeant from the Russian army to tell me what to do about that. And he helped me sort out that part. And basically, soon after that, I think some of the administrators realized I had these horses, and they didn't take them away from me. They actually made me a contractor. And I signed a contract at 5,000 kroner a month, and I became a cartage contractor. I was carting goods from one place to another, both for the Russians and the Czechs, and I delivered every day food for the SS that were incarcerated in the Kleine Festung. And that's basically the 3 months that happened to me while I was in Theresienstadt.
So you got a whole lot of story there, for sure. More than necessarily I expected even. Sometimes, especially because he was the first, we asked him over 2,000 questions. And so he sometimes has multiple answers to the same question. But I really do love the power of just kind of having stumbled upon some horses and sort of commandeering them, but then growing to love them and having them have this really beautiful relationship together and supporting each other. One more I maybe just demonstrate, which sometimes can take similarly, I don't know, he's got some versions of this that are very quick and some versions that are a little longer, so I may cut him off if it's feeling like it's running a little bit long, but I always love this. can you sing us a song?
שיר המעלות ושוב אדוני את שיבת ציון היינו כחולמים עוד ימלא שיחוי פינה אפשרנו רינה עוד יאמרו בגויים הנה רי לי רי לי 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 רי לי רי לי רי לי 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 לי.
So he's got a whole set of songs available to us that he shared for perpetuity in this way, because he too was a cantor, and has we do have a few survivors with stunning voices, and we're grateful that they were able to lend them to us in this way. So that more or less, I have a little thank you slide, but I don't know if you necessarily need to see that. Thank you. That does conclude my presentation here, but I welcome any questions if you have them. If you have anything you want to ask Pinchas as well, I'm happy to be your mouthpiece there. And just, yeah, thank you for participating and watching.
Thank you so much for this, Greg. It's really comprehensive. And I visited the USC Shoah Foundation about 3 years ago as we were prepping to open our site and really discussing IWOC. And I will tell everybody who's on this presentation now that I was so impressed with everyone's intellect and curiosity, and you know, the sensitivity with which you developed a new technology is really astounding. So we're very happy to be, you know, be able to feature you and your work. Questions to you. How much context of the Holocaust would you say students need before they start exploring testimony? Sam's question.
It's a very good question. I think it really depends. We believe our approach has always been in education to meet students and teachers where they are at. We want to make the barrier of entry into Holocaust education relative and genocide education more broadly as easy as possible. And so that's why we have the 400 plus activities that appear in multiple languages, yes, but also in multiple grade levels from kindergarten to university levels. And you would imagine that a kindergarten age student probably does not have a rich foundation in Holocaust pedagogy and history. To that end, we generally believe that you need the context that you need. Which I know is vague, and I wish I could give you a more concrete answer, but essentially we try to provide sort of what is necessary in order to understand the clip. And the clip of testimony might provide the context indeed for a further revelation about the learning. But it's really a matter of what are the learning aims, and does the context need to be provided in order to get closer to those learning aims? Because we don't want to overwhelm the students with facts when the emotional impact of the stories can make those facts frankly sink in a deeper way, but which may be also closer to really our pedagogical goals. So I'm sorry I don't have a particularly tight.
Oh no, it's very hard.
No, I mean, I just it ranges across the board.
Absolutely, and there also, I think, when we use testimony or clips, we always say that there needs to be some major scaffolding before you start watching it, and historical context needs to be provided. But then I think it's really well suited in any classroom discussion. Alejandro has the following question. Any idea when the other testimonies in dimension and testimony format will be available online, like this one with Pinchas?
So I can't necessarily answer that question. We have a variety of steps in between now and then. I know one of our next goals for sure is to include a female identified survivor, because we definitely believe in diversity of gender balance as well as of experience. Pinchas there's also some kind of complex contractual things involving that some of these survivors are interviewed in conjunction with partnerships with museums where they are featured there. So there's some questions we have to navigate and a few technological challenges to overcome. All of which is to say, again, I'm sorry, I don't have a particularly precise answer for that, but it is a priority for us, and I appreciate you voicing it, and I appreciate the interest.
Okay, that's great. This type of thing takes time for sure. Yeah. So, how and why did the USC Shoah Foundation decide to go from covering the Holocaust only to broadening its scope to all other genocides? What went into this? It's especially interesting for me to hear this as kind of like a peer-ish organization, because I think this is that question that many Holocaust education centers are challenged with.
And I love that question. And I don't want to purport to necessarily represent the broad Shoah Foundation with my answer to it, knowing that I was not present in the era that we made that decision. But I know it was a complicated decision to make, because certainly based on our name alone, we were certainly rooted in the Holocaust. It is certainly the vast majority of the stories that we offer. I know for me personally, and I believe this would be echoed within the Institute, that genocide there are so many patterns, and while the numbers of the Holocaust are horrific, so are the numbers of individuals who were murdered in the Armenian genocide and the genocide in Rwanda, and in all these other incidents. There are similarities and there are differences, and there's a lot to learn in all the cases. There's stories, the stories in Rwanda of how propaganda was able to turn neighbors against neighbors and sometimes spouses against one another even, are horrifying and highly relevant to, frankly, exploring the Holocaust and vice versa. To my mind, featuring content in the Visual History Archive is an important recognition of the importance of the history. And it's not to say that events that are not featured in the Visual History Archive are not being recognized in that way, but to say that it's vital that we elevate what we can and we give platforms a voice. I know there's a lot that goes into, and some of it's, frankly, there's challenges with funding. It's not cheap to make testimony. And so wanting to try to gather support and make sure that there's energy behind collecting a certain experience group. But for our educational goals too, it's a huge, huge piece, because frankly, we want students to see a diversity of skin tones, and a diversity of nationalities and of experiences, and to recognize that of course, we're very different and we're very alike, and how hate is hate. So that's probably the closest answer I've got.
And that's fabulous. And I think it's, every institution needs to go through their soul searching to come to the right conclusions. But I very much appreciate that you guys have this broad and diverse perspective for sure. Do you have any kind of like activities or lesson plans that looks at this intersectionality? So like takes different experiences.
We certainly do. I mean, to pull up briefly our work in our beta site, because I think it's prettier. The beta site being the one that's soon going to be the formal version of the website, where I'm actually going to log out so you see a more accurate representation of what we offer, since I see a lot of activities that are not published. So essentially, we have a breadth. So we recently published a series of primary education activities that mostly have been rooted in experiences from Holocaust survivors, and we certainly have. I'm going to reduce our language collection to English just to make it a little bit easier for our viewers here. What you'll find, it's a little bit, there are some activities that are more focused on overall pedagogy about genocide. However, what the bulk of sort of our comparative genocide stories and topics tend to be a little bit more thematic. So here we have a whole series. I'm not honestly 100% sure what we'll find in this one, we have a whole series. Here we have a little, I mean, 2 Jewish survivors and a liberator from the army. So that's all from the Holocaust collection. But here we have our sort of social emotional learning series on which we called Mindful Explorations. I'm just going to I'm hoping I can find a few better examples for us. So like talking about belonging. Oh, let's see what we find. No, more Holocaust survivor. I'm choosing unluckily. But essentially what we tend to find is that there's stories, for example, we have a really phenomenal activity called The Danger of a Single Story. It's based on a TED Talk from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the author, who talks about how having one story about a people results in a misperception of what that people as an institution is. And so we offer a variety of voices about different groups to get at that point. Trying to see if I can find one that I know really reaches the breadth. I would love to. You can see a lot of themes emerging across the place, and you see a lot of non-English content.
Yeah, lots of Hungarian stuff. The
stories from the Guatemalan genocide, a variety of translated activities about Oskar Schindler, story about friendship in the Holocaust and how it helped sustain. It ranges. Rwandan collections, but I think maybe like reflections on identity. Here you have an Armenian survivor, a Cambodian survivor, and a Jewish survivor talking about where they're from, and sort of invoking questions of identity for students, and helping them recognize how their backgrounds influence who they are and how they perceive themselves. So there's a lot that one can explore, but definitely we prioritize. And also on our watch page where you see there's a lot of different, I recognize we're tight on time at this point. So our range of topics, some of these topics are things like Auschwitz, where that's obviously very Holocaust specific, but then you get children or dilemma or education, discrimination, courage. And these topics are inherently
Then I met this guy in the street.
So you have Holocaust testimonies, and you have Romeo Dallaire, who is a liberator and the head of the UN Assistance Mission in Rwanda, Rwandan survivors, Armenian witnesses, or miscellaneous in that case, Nanjing massacre survivors and others, talking about moments when they needed to summon courage.
That's fantastic. It's really interesting to see how, approaching it from a theme-based perspective, how you can get such a wide viewpoint. So thank you so much for being with us today, Greg. I mean, this is fascinating, and the future, and it's great to be talking to you and to partnering with you. We really appreciate everything.
It is my pleasure to be part of this. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care.
And thank you all for participating.
Yes, thanks to everybody in our audience. Take care. Bye-bye.